This is Canon Fodder, episode 37, live from Jazz Age, New York. This week, my guest returning to the show. He is a podcaster, he is a writer, he is an Orthodox Christian, and one of the scariest men living, Mr. Arthur Dayne. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm good, and I'm good. I wanted to ask before we started,
hmm
how's the fighting going?
You know, honestly, I've been focusing the past 2 years on building anti-fragile athletes and work and getting married and like living abroad and whatnot. And now that things are, I think I've finally stabilized and I'm about to scale. I can live properly the way I was before.
Mm,
So I'm hoping to take a fight somewhere in Europe, in August or September. And then I have to go to Malaysia in September for a good friend of mine's wedding. Again, he's a Substacker himself, Alex Leon. And after that, I'll be fighting in Thailand for 2 months and then headed to Japan. And after that, I'm hoping that San Francisco has some semblance of normalcy, which isn't too far fetched from what I'm hearing on the ground. And I'll return to my old gym and I'll compete at least 3 weekends out of the month, mostly in jujitsu, mainly because jujitsu you can compete every weekend because it's not concussive, and just to have that competitive edge again, getting used to fighting every Saturday, and then I'll try to fight Muay Thai once a month or once every 6 weeks, so I'll kind of be settled business wise, wife surrounded by family, and I'll be able to sort of compartmentalize everything to the extent that it needs to because it takes a lot of hours. And it's going to take, full time effort and a legitimate 40 hours a week, if not more. So,
most definitely, and it'll be cool if you when you get a fight to just tell the boys, and you'll have a bunch of beavers try to show up. Uh,
yeah, that'd be awesome. I'd love to have the Beaver Gang, over in San Francisco, the place that everyone, loves to say, like, oh, well, gosh, we don't want this place to turn into San Francisco. I want them to see it absolutely up close, and hopefully in the future an OGC chapter up there, under the radar.
yeah, it's funny. Tucker Carlson was in Australia, and he just dropped a talk that he gave, and he was saying it's like, hey, listen, Australia is really nice. Don't let it become London or San Francisco. I think he named. Uh, so your native home is taking strays from every direction.
Yeah, I expect it to. Uh, I mean, I talk about this sort of anti-culture a lot, and I've been threatening to finish a Substack article about anti-culture that's like thousands of words down, still not finished yet. But we were ground zero for it. San Francisco has a culture under all that muck, but we're ground zero for what's exported worldwide that a lot of countries hate America for. It's very sad, but it is reality.
So we're here today to actually talk about one of our mutually favorite books, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. You are probably the biggest Fitzgerald fan that I know, and I wanted to kind of give you the floor to explore your admiration for not only the writer but also maybe him as a man. Although it's a little harder to admire him as a man, uh, just because of certain pitfalls in his personality. But yeah, I wanted to explore that.
Certainly. I mentioned to you before when we recorded Mr. Bourbon about my favorite writer, the only writer I love more than Fitzgerald, Hempson, that I had that what I'm finding is actually somewhat of a stereotypical, sensitive young man, distraught, uh, sort of neurodivergent experience of sophomore English. I had a teacher who, he was a gruff man from Buffalo, New York, who it was my first period English class of sophomore year after a summer where I'd experienced some pretty significant tragedy and I had nothing nice to say, but I had a lot to say and a lot to bleed out and I didn't know how. Um, Not only was he good at getting me to love to write, he was very good at giving life to all the literary movements of the United States. The first one that really grabbed my attention was transcendentalism, especially because that previous summer I had gotten very horrendous piece of news about a person I had feelings for committing suicide. And I went through Boy Scout camp, and I felt the sort of healing aspect of nature. And so reading Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Bronson Alcott and Ismail Alcott, I was like, this resonates. And for whatever reason, modernism really took shape for me. I saw it as valuable, although when we sort of look at things from our lens on our side of the political spectrum, we don't really view it with a lot of admiration. We view it as a form of decay. But it was explained to me as a movement that was shell shocked from World War One. I was shell shocked from the splitting open of traditional monarchical European society ruling over the world. At the time, monarchy was, it was pretty much in every European country except France, Switzerland, and Portugal. And that seemed like it was going to be there forever. The only way that that was going to go away was through suicide, and that's just what World War One was. On the flip side of things, you had the sort of glimpse of an American coming out party, an American question of isolation, was quickly put under pressure, thanks to J.P. Morgan and Woodrow Wilson. And our showing in the Meuse Argonne Forest was one that ended the war within 6 weeks, thanks to Major Charles Whittlesey. So there was this kind of question in the minds of Americans, like, well, hang on, this sort of society that we were birthed from, and now we're backwater, strange, strongman frontier of, seems to be rupturing, and maybe we can take that top spot. Maybe we can stop this slow grind of humility. Maybe we can take a shot at greatness, take a shot at that sort of overman's rise that Nietzsche was calling for several decades prior. And the movement itself was explained to me as a departure from formal syntax, meaning, instead of the rather textbook climb that we all do indeed love, sort of an intro and a climb and a climax, a denouement, a conclusion that sort of brings you full circle, a very Joseph Campbell hero's journey. Instead, it just ends abruptly because war, an expression of society, stopped being something that was glorious. It stopped being something where even if you die, there's like this heroic death that meant something. Because for 4 years, people were let out of the trenches for maybe a gain of 30 miles, for a stalemate that destroyed the two countries that are considered to be the heart of Europe, in France and Germany. And all of a sudden, everyone's questioning everything. And all of a sudden, maybe the way we structured society all this time, maybe that was wrong. And you had things like Bilfism pop up, belief in reincarnation. You had people sort of going to seances. You had people being self-prescribed Nietzscheans, which I found surprising because we see sort of Nietzscheans now as these edgelord Twitter types. Back then, it was a legitimate question. And above all, we had the assignment of God being whoever it is that is best at the allocation of resources, whether that be down the line FDR, a certain mustache man, or just Stalin. And then you have this man, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who is adjacent to New York, and anyone who kind of understands America, for better or for worse, like the health of France and the health of Germany dictates the health of Europe. There's a mirror for the United States and New York. If New York is in good health, the United States is in good health, and vice versa. And as we can see right now, both are in very poor health. And F. Scott Fitzgerald is able to sort of put his ear to the ground. He's, went to Princeton. He was able to appeal to the intelligentsia, these Ivy League men who were fascinated with this shift in ideas, growing kind of nihilism that was very attractive, and paired with the backdrop of skyscrapers in New York City and this abundance of just black. You can sort of feel this fascination that's almost Faustian and fatal. And he sort of defined the movement with This Side of Paradise in 1920. And that book ends abruptly. And it's not so much as a tragedy where it's like this sort of big, sprawling, Shakespearean tragedy where you see the descent coming and it's magnificent, like Fortinbras arriving at the end of Hamlet, or Troilus' soliloquy at the end of Troilus and Cressida, although one can make an argument that's a precursor for modernism because of how bleak it is. It just ends. Like, you may not get an ending. You don't deserve an ending because all those men in the trenches didn't get an ending. They just abruptly died when they stuck their head up. That was it. There's nothing poetic about it. everyone lost. And so I thought that was very fascinating because I was in a stage in my life where someone's life had ended abruptly before it should have, and I said, this is reality. Like this is hard reality, and I didn't understand it's a hard godless reality at the time because I didn't have God in my life. But life removed from God, that quite modernism is the reality, and he was able to put all these questions and put them into these Ivy Leaguers dancing with fatal women with fatal ideas, and that was what the intelligentsia was into at the time. I just finished reading The Beautiful and Damned, and it seems it's about twice the length of This Side of Paradise, and it just sort of indulges in that even further, and people loved it. He was appealing to his fellow Ivy League men, and then he decided, I want to write a or the great American novel, and he set out to do that in Gatsby, and despite it not being popular, only selling 23,000 copies, because he departed from writing about Ivy League men. He started writing about a self-made man who created an identity out of nothing and stepped into it, much like Fitzgerald himself, which I'm sure we can get to in a bit. But he set out to do this goal, and like the characters in his previous novel, it was for him at the time fatal. But Gatsby, I found the character itself personified the dilemma of America, whether to continue to remain humble and steady or to take a shot at the sort of overman rise, which is usually fatal.
You said a lot there, and I'm trying to digest it because all of it I think good. And I wanted to ask you because it's something that, I've thought about a lot when it comes to war and battle. Like World War One, there's clearly a sea change when it comes to how war is perceived in the minds of people who fight it and those who kind of witness it. And I wonder, was it always the Somme? It's just a matter of scale and availability of media, or was World War One like an aberration in martial matters?
I think this is such a really good question. I have a series going on in my podcast right now, 7-part series, and my new co-host for all things sort of history and political theory named Mercatorus. And it started with this question of Hugo Grotius and the Jus Publicum Europam, and we covered the 30 Years' War. And Thomas 777 recently enlightened me that that was actually the nihilistic "it's over" moment for
Mm-hmm.
Mustache Man, which I found really interesting. And I studied more about that. It's like, well, yeah, 52% of Germans died, and granted, Germany lived on, although it was never the same centralized hold over Western Europe ever again until the Third Reich. But I'm sure there was nothing glamorous about that.
Yeah, that's what I think. I think about the, and it is sort of white pilling in a sense that it's like, oh, as bad as things are now, it's not as materially awful as, say, the 30 Years' War or the bubonic plague. Civilization survived cataclysmic events before, and
Yeah.
now it's just our cataclysm to avoid. Although it's a bit worse because it's self-inflicted.
I mean, you
But
can
then,
honestly you can make the argument too that all of these are sort of
mhm,
self-inflicted. Like that's
right.
what we're coming to realize in our studying. Like just it's so black pilling reading about the 30 Years' War because like that in particular, like the Peace of Westphalia, you can argue is the rise of secularism in the name of peace, which I guess is a noble cause. But peace could have been arrived at much earlier. But each sort of phase of the war, Gustavus Adolphus and King of Denmark, and especially Cardinal Richelieu, acting as sort of the slime ball that he was, it just prolonged something. And Germany itself suffered. Sweden, Denmark, France, Spain, all of these didn't really suffer all that much. Although you can argue the Habsburgs, but I think what to answer your question regarding World War One though is despite all of that, despite 30 Years' War, despite you could sort of think of all of the smaller wars, all the punitive wars that were allowed in Europe, with the rise of these public Europe after. At least they were like fighting. They were actually like fighting to preserve something, and they had less horrible means to do so. Whereas World War One, nothing was being preserved. There was no real reason to be there. There wasn't like this question over Christianity. Like that's a big deal to fight over. Like heresy is a big deal because it is a macro understanding of salvation, for better or for worse. This World War One itself is just sort of the inevitable rise of glimpses at harrowing modern warfare that we've seen in the likes of the Crimean War, that made Tolstoy so bitter and jaded, the Boer War, which is sort of the writing on the wall of British decay, the Russo-Japanese War, saying, okay, wait a second, someone outside of Europe can actually run our playbook pretty well, with incredible efficiency. So it's like all of these things sort of came to a headway, and I think it could have been stopped. Like it could have been prevented easily, but like no, we just have that itch, and I think that is sort of like the death of any of that combat at least having meaning. Yeah, it's a more technologically advanced form of brutality, but still probably the same level of brutality nonetheless, but for nothing basically.
So I guess that leads us to Gatsby, right? Because The Great Gatsby is about World War One and its aftermath. Nick Carraway has served in World War One. Jay Gatsby also served in World War One. Fitzgerald, he was an American serviceman, so that definitely colors his experience of the war. Short book, the things that people are told to read in high school. I didn't read Gatsby in high school. I don't know what your experience was there, but I ended up picking it up later, kind of half-handedly. I was like, well, this is the thing that everybody has to read growing up, so I might as well get it out of the way. And then I ended up really enjoying it. And I think the thing that it gets knocked on these days is because your English teacher would so heavily hammer on the symbolism of certain things, because there's a lot of really obvious symbolism that of course could mean 5 million different things depending on the day, that it's sort of it's seen by some as like baby's first literature, which I think is unfounded and kind of unfair.
Yeah, I think I remember in high school. So I transferred high school, so I read it once in sophomore year, and I read it once again in junior year. And there's jokes. Our desk is sort of set up in four, and I really hit my stride in terms of writing and literature in this class. And there'd be jokes. It's like, what did grade you get? Of course you got an A. You're fucking Jesus of English in this class. Fuck you. Like it was that kind of attitude. And I was like, stay mad, I guess. I don't know. Um, but a lot of those moments came from me sort of like analyzing that symbolism and looking back. Like I just thought it was so deep. I was like, oh wow, the red and the gold leaves of autumn are here, and gold is the end of everything. Like he's achieved this material success, like the gold leaves, and there's this red pool of blood in the water. There comes the end with it. Gold is fatal, material success is fatal. And I can see where people get that, like baby's first literature, because in a lot of ways, for me, it was.
Mm.
But the problem with that statement is it pigeonholes it into something that is a stopgap and not what I think is the most important piece of American literature ever. And until America is destroyed or transforms into something else entirely, it will continue to be the greatest and most important piece of American literature ever when it comes to its respective canon. And I posted about this recently. Like Hemingway is our more celebrated writer of the two, but Hemingway was also a universalist. Like
Hmm.
Hemingway didn't write defining American literature. He wasn't to the United States what Fitzgerald was. He wasn't what Steinbeck was to California, or Willa Cather was to the Great Plains, or Faulkner to the South. He was universal. So when it comes to like what is vital, it can't be overstated. And I think, I mean, despite it being a very short book, I feel like it should be taught over the course of like 2 months rather than a month, which is typically what the curriculum allows for in high schools. And you have 4 weeks, and then you have the test, maybe even less time. And I think people, just because that color symbolism is there, and the eyes of T.J. Eichelberg are there, the eyes of God, and that's very much spelled out for us in some of the ramblings of the mechanic, Mr. Wilson. But it's a lot more than that. And the shame of it is you kind of need to teach us surrounding historical context as well, and understand where America is at and how that defines today, in order to really understand the gravity of it. And it's literature usually isn't taught that way. It's
Mm.
usually taught in isolation, which I think is a problem.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. It'd be, especially for developing minds. George Bagby has some interesting ideas about this, about what should and shouldn't be taught to younger people. And I actually don't know what his thoughts on Gatsby are. I'd be interested to hear him say something. So you have some clicking or some clacking in the background.
There we go.
Okay. So I guess we'll get into the plot of Gatsby a little bit. Nick Carraway, he's Yale man, World War One veteran, moves to New York. He's got a cousin, Daisy Buchanan, who's married to Tom. He's not really there in terms of character. He's kind of more of a vehicle for the audience. Fair, unfair.
I'd say that's fair. I mean, he color. I think the thing that Nick Carraway colors the most is the sort of daydreams that he lays over the story themselves. He's the lens, to say the least.
Right, and I guess some people have a problem with that, but mostly because they only watch, say, the film adaptations of The Great Gatsby rather than read it. And I think because Gatsby is such an intoxicating figure himself, if Nick had more of a character, it would almost detract from the story that we're hearing. Because you need something of a narrator, right? But someone who also interacts with the world, right? Like nobody accused Watson of being like this great character, right? He's just Holmes's guy. It's not Watson's place to steal the show. He's only there to convey the information as he knows it.
Yeah, I mean, he's both Watson and Carraway. They're just probably the best straight men you could ask for.
Mm.
And in the respective relationships to Holmes and Gatsby, they're actually the best friends that you could ask for.
Okay, so moving from here, so Nick moves to Long Island, New York. He lives in the West Egg, which is people see it as there's West Egg and East Egg, and East Egg is kind of the more established older town. West Egg is seen as more like a new money suburb, which is funny because they're right next to each other, and we get the feeling right away that yes, while this age of America is full of economic progress and promise and good times, we are in the roaring 20s after all. There is this underlying understanding of new money versus old money. Thoughts there, Arthur?
Yeah, when you kind of think of New York before the 1920s, you like in some ways you may as well just be thinking of the New York of the American Revolution. And yeah, of course, it's gone through changes, especially the Industrial Revolution. It's the house of Gilded Age men, and the likes of J.P. Morgan and the Vanderbilts had some, and Rockefellers and Carnegies, so on and so forth. So it's like this. From the Revolution until the Gilded Age, up until World War One, it was the center of American aristocracy outside of Washington D.C.
Mm,
And you can argue, I mean, in the cases of yellow journalism as well, with Joseph Pulitzer and all that, that really that is just the center. It's not really Washington D.C. And when you sort of jump into the 1920s, World War One, part of the anything goes side of things is there being celebrity outside of legitimacy. What I mean by that is entertainment kind of creating these rival figures of culture, right? So you have the attention through being a Broadway star, and then you have the attention of the people by being a star on a silver screen across the country.
mm,
You can tell stories visually across the country and influence things accordingly. That's a pretty big uprising in the world of the American aristocracy. All of a sudden, everything isn't so centralized, and maybe they don't have the most control in the world. But if we think about today, what is best at administering propaganda? It's not bankers, funding NGOs. The most direct form of propaganda we receive is in entertainment. is through Hollywood. In some cases now big tech, but that's just a further atomized version of those silver screens, past television. Um, and on the other side of things, we have, so something that you're very familiar with is the bootleggers. There's a whole host of people making fortunes in crime. We could go briefly into the mob, how much of a hand they had in the heart of America, well into the 1970s at the very latest, or very least, rather. There's still some remnants of that today. So all of a sudden, you have this degenerate means of influence. You have a Semitic means of influence. The bulk of Hollywood studios run by Semitic individuals, um, and that's pretty troubling for old money types who, several decades prior, made quite a bit of money in shipping or railroads or steamships or iron or oil. And that's a scary thing on the domestic front. In the international front, we have the sort of suicide of Europe. On the domestic front, we have this decay from within. So it's a sorry state of affairs for America right from the jump.
And it's funny too, because I think this book is even more prescient than people realize. There is right at the end, the Roaring Twenties end with the market crash, right? And it kind of plays out the same way that that Fitzgerald is talking about, how the old money New Yorkers, especially those who originally came from the Midwest, need to leave and go back to the Midwest and go back to their roots, and how their families made their fortunes, like these mega fortunes that are being made through speculation and through ways of making money that hadn't been done before, really, and end up killing them, and end up losing. The old money kind of falls away because of the implosion of the market. These people, they play with forces that they don't quite understand. They get burned by it.
Yeah, certainly. What's interesting at the beginning of The Beautiful and Damned, the protagonist's grandfather, is a Civil War veteran. He just sort of, even says in the book, he charged straight into Wall Street and made, some $40 million of that times money, which is an absurd amount of money today. Don't ask me for the direct calculation. And that was, and he has this sort of departure from that, where he suddenly becomes, a temperance movement kind of guy, and an advocate for prohibition leading up to the 1920s. And I think there was a fair bit of, in the opposite direction, new money types who had, made their fortune in speculation, kind of realizing, like, okay, if everyone keeps doing this like I did, the society from which I came will probably never be the same. And that speculation was correct. That fear was going to be, and was indeed, fully realized.
We also see that Gatsby himself is, although he tries to come off as an old money wasp, and then he tries to come off as legitimate. The way that he hosts his parties, the dazzling spectacle of his lifestyle, is so clearly out of sorts with. He's almost like a trained monkey, really, for these older types, for the Tom Buchanans of the world.
Yeah, I think so. The first rule of, like, if you're new money and you don't really want to appear old money, you don't make a fuss. Like, old money does not feel the need to sort of put on these glitzy extravaganzas, like he's putting on. And like, not to say in his defense, like he's a real person, but in some ways, I think he actually is F. Scott Fitzgerald. And the more you sort of look into it, the more you realize that's actually the case. I think he's also a man sort of going with the times in that regard. And granted, he's throwing these parties to get the attention of Daisy. So he buys this replica of this Normandy style mansion. It's just, with turrets and things, across the water on West Egg, from the Buchanan's estate in East Egg. And he prays that one day Daisy, this woman whom he fell in love with in Louisville, close to where he was stationed right before he deployed for World War One, who wound up marrying this old money inheritor of a fortune out of Chicago. Um, he's hoping that he'll be able to get her back now that he's made something of himself, and that he will. be able to sort of lure her out of that house across the water and into one of these parties for him to see her again. So on one side of things, you could make the argument that it's utilitarian in the sense that he just literally is trying to garner the most attention from Daisy as possible. On the other side of things too, the 1920s is kind of like, all right, the old ways are gone. What are the new ways in terms of what's going to be a zeitgeist defining demonstration? And you couldn't really put on this sort of a old world. I think the new world really starts like in the 20s. You couldn't put on these old world styles of parties and consider that to be something that is going to garner attention as something brave and new because it wasn't. And so I think that those are two things that go into play there. But naturally, all the old money in East Egg, you're like, oh, well, what's all that about? There's going to be a significant amount of skepticism there.
At the end of Gatsby, we kind of get a Robert Frost-esque, like nothing gold can stay sort of ending, right? No one attends his funeral, and Nick Carraway gets a better sense of the man through his father, and this ends up becoming the inspiring moment for Nick to leave New York and leave this sort of den of illegitimacy behind him. Who was Jay Gatsby?
I think Jay Gatsby was F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Mm.
And that becomes clearer and clearer the more you read Gatsby over and over. This is like my fourth or fifth time reading Gatsby. One of which was actually in a beautiful like watercolor comic book that I found in Healdsburg, California. It was a beautiful piece of literature, like beautiful piece of work.
Mm.
And Fitzgerald, he's been called sort of like Midwestern nobody, but he got into Princeton. And he came from like a middle class enough family, basically. And it was kind of the next step, if you sort of look in generational terms, the natural next step for him to, try to be an Ivy League man and be in those circles. And today, Princeton in particular has a particular prestige because Harvard has sort of made efforts to quote unquote get with the times. And same thing with Yale. But to this day in Princeton, you can't transfer to Princeton. You can only get in out of high school. So there's a certain cachet there. And he realized he didn't have the pedigree of his classmates, but he had a certain amount of skills. And the best way for him to get into those circles is not to buy his way in and not to marry his way in, but to write himself into it. And that's just what he did. To the level of success he achieved in that, I think is inconclusive. If you really want to be a yes or a no, I'd say no. But he got something far greater than that, which is literally being the facilitator of a literary movement in its entirety. And writing, he set out to write a or the great American novel with Gatsby, and he wrote the great American novel with Gatsby. Mm-hmm. I think that is more success than any of the people he wanted to rub shoulders with could even conceive of, quite frankly. And when I say conceive of, I really do mean it, in the sense that these men were brought up with a silver spoon in their mouth and now without any vitality. And, our side of things has a certain respect for a legitimate aristocracy, and as do I. But more often than not, when you reach however many generations down the line, there's just going to be far less vigor and far less fervor to make something of yourself. Especially in the American context. It's a bit different in the case of the British Empire. It's a bit different in the case of Europe in general. If I have what I have and I don't really need anything else, why would I conceive of defining something? Why would I conceive of this big shakeup when everything is fine in its own in normalcy? This normalcy is good. Why would I rock the boat? And that's where he will always be on the other side of things, despite him being an Ivy League man himself and him writing about Ivy League men like Anthony Patch in The Beautiful and Damned. But when you read about when you read the letters that are somewhat accessible to the public from F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he talks about, he's writing to a publisher, hey, could I actually get, This Side of Paradise published a bit earlier? I really want this success to basically show to Zelda Sayer that I am legitimate. Like I have something to say. Like I am going to be an integral part of society, one way or another, whether through traditional means or invented means. In this case, certainly invented means. And can we get this moved up? And it was a smash hit. It just completely rocked America's world. And the more you sort of read about the way that he acted, it seemed like he was putting on a facade, but he was gradually becoming a facade. He was becoming his mask. And it was beyond time and space, this facade. And in the midst of New York, I actually wrote about this last night on Instagram. I just sort of saw this video of a New York night, and I remember my time there. And I just remembered that, and I'm sure this is true back then as well. In the context of New York City, everyone is moving so fast that very few people are actually going to take the time to stop and look at you and see who you really are. So if you present yourself as something, if you say you're someone, no one has the time to question you unless you're holding up a line, stopping traffic, or walking too slow.
Yeah, you can't slow down in New York. And that that's
No.
that's dangerous. I lived there for a bit, and you need to get from point A to point B very quickly, and people are automatically suspicious of anyone who, one, they'll either think that you're a lost tourist, or they'll think that you have a screw loose somewhere, uh,
Yeah,
and that you should be even more avoided than everyone else, right? There's an understanding that, and I wonder, I think it might be an overcrowding problem because New York is so densely packed in that you know you're so constantly stimulated by other people being around you that you try desperately to carve out a piece of personal space one way or another.
certainly. I think very few people understand that there actually is a way you can go about New York where you just sort of float and you just sort of let things take you, and it's a very peaceful way to go about New York. And I feel like I achieved it for several days, just only several days, because I had a bottom line to meet in a lot of ways. Um,
Yeah, that's
but
the thing too, is that New York can be a lot of fun if money's not an issue. As soon as it becomes one, New York's not so fun.
and if you don't know why you're there, you'll get crushed. If you don't have a legitimate reason to be there, you will absolutely get murdered. In regards to Gatsby, the way you read Nick Carraway's descriptions of him, i.e., Fitzgerald's descriptions of him, he is like even in scenes where he's interacting in like a vulnerable way. When he's speaking with Carraway when he's in the bushes, the Buchanan estate, like shh, don't say anything. Daisy says she's gonna turn the lights on and off and then back on if there's any trouble. Like even when he's vulnerable, he doesn't seem human. He seems like this beaming golden archetype that is just walking amongst men. And there was a time in Fitzgerald's life where he was just that, from about 1920 to 1925, just a good 5 years of his life. And I think that is what Americans actually want. I don't see many Americans today who are lucid, who want a genuinely sort of humble, steady life. I see, and if they're if they're devout Christians, whole different ballgame. But true practicing devout Christianity is actually very, very hard to come by. Many people are still just going through the motions. And when you ask people the American dream, for those who still believe in it, whether directly or indirectly, when you ask them, why are you in America? Oh, it's good for, getting ahead and this, and that's true. It is still great for upward mobility if you really want to push yourself. They are after something beyond, and they are trying to step into that. And I don't think there is a greater concentration of that is more potent than F. Scott Fitzgerald, who is also Jay Gatsby.
That begs the question then, is Zelda Daisy and all the implications there? Because we see that Daisy is the object of Gatsby's affections, but we
Mhm.
also get the sense that it's unearned. She doesn't sort of deserve it, and it destroys him. She is his downfall.
Yeah, what's sadder about it is its actual true like agape. Like it's true unconditional love with a undying fervor that scales continents, that is willing to go into the bootlegging industry, is willing to absolutely work himself to the bone just to get close to. And once he gets close, he can't let go. And Daisy is most certainly not worth it. Like, what really, there's a line in Gatsby when there's this confrontation in this hotel room in New York City on that hot day between Buchanan and Gatsby, where Daisy looks like she's actually going to go through with it. She has this courage, and there's a line in there, and I'm paraphrasing, where it says, what little courage she had was gone. Just like, just for like 2 minutes, she had the courage, and it was back to just, well, I just want to be, as she said, a pretty little fool, and whoever corrals me best, in this case it was Tom Buchanan, will have me. And that is certainly not worth it at all. But I think the problem with Fitzgerald, and I think the problem with Gatsby, and the problem with Anthony Comstock Patch, is they didn't want a woman, they wanted the woman. They wanted the woman that was sought after. And Zelda Sayre was sought after. And there was a woman before Zelda Sayre in Fitzgerald's life, a Chicago socialite, that he was desperately after until he finally gave up and brought those attentions to Zelda Sayre in the South. And for men who achieve what he achieved is an absolute fatal waste. And the illusion there is that if I have achieved that, I need a woman who has achieved something, whether in the literal or in a fantasy that I've conjured up in my mind. And that is I think that is the most directly present, like that is the most direct way to describe it. And not to, I did this last time when we talked about hunger. I was citing Victoria by Northampton, but in The Beautiful and Damned, there's an interlude where this large, this larger, very masculine voice is speaking to what is allegedly the goddess of beauty, and he's like, "You're going to be a jazz girl," and she's like, "Well, I like being a jazz girl. Oh, you'll love it very much." And he was looking for that ethereal match, that ethereal illusion, and Zelda wasn't it, and Daisy wasn't it at either. And looking later into Fitzgerald's life, he wrote "Tender as the Night," which I haven't read yet, but Christopher Sandbach alleges is the greatest romance novel in American history. And then he went through his subsequent alcoholism, um, and he was a screenwriter in Los Angeles. And then he wrote his unfinished last book, The Last Tycoon. And everything sort of faded, just like it faded for Anthony Patch, but it actually didn't fade for Gatsby. Gatsby is if Fitzgerald died in 1925.
Mm.
Gatsby is if he burned out as opposed to faded away. And really, Fitzgerald just faded away as much as he likes to think he burned out.
Right, and you read his correspondence, especially with other writers like Hemingway, and Fitzgerald can't understand why he's not read anymore, why he's not popular, what he's lost, and he really does feel stuck in the 1920s, and he hasn't been able to get past that. He doesn't have his pulse on, or he doesn't have his finger on the pulse of America anymore. So yeah, I think you're right. He loses some luster because he no longer has anything to say about the quote unquote new world.
Yeah, and there's a description of him, when he came to Los Angeles, that he had lost his sort of iconic middle part of his hair. That was like, you have the high cheekbones, lean face, middle part, and here he is with like a side part and a chubby face, and he sort of had it written all over him. And what's interesting too, in Hemingway's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he talks about, I'm paraphrasing here, he says, a writer must write what he means, not say it. There are many people, he's like, a writer's work is best done alone. Many people sort of seek social gatherings and find that their writing has suffered. And I actually, when I read that, I thought he was talking about Fitzgerald, because I think another case of Fitzgerald is he really fell in love with the attention. I think in some ways, he liked the attention more to the writing, even though he continued to be talented. Um, in his later works. And I think too, a big problem that he had to face is so much happened from 1920 until the point that he died. I think in 1940. The world is just rapidly changing in crazy extent. When we think about from 1920 to 1940, we're thinking about the entirety of the Jazz Age. We're thinking about the Great Depression. Thinking of, I mean, I'm sure you heard something of Huey Long's attempted rival of FDR. We know that Nazi Germany is in the wings. We know that the Soviet Union is in the wings. And the world has moved on from what was supposed to be a fancier new continuation of the old world repackaged. And in fact, we have a much more harrowing new world now that moves faster than he ever wanted to, move faster than the 20s, and towards ways of life that he would never want to partake in. Far grittier, far sadder, far more harrowing, not even close to being as glitzy and alluring. And I think he couldn't handle that. And I think that, besides the fact that his wife was suffering from schizophrenia, I think that was a big reason for his drinking as well. It's just eventually fatal alcoholism.
So, Arthur, I kind of want to wrap it up here because one, I'm running out of time myself, but also I think that we could do a plot summary and all that. And again, I'm reluctant to do that because it's sort of fake. I wanted to know where people can find you, where they can support your work, and how they can get more Arthur Dayne.
Yeah, certainly. My moniker is Blood and Rain. It's named after a poem that I wrote about 6 years ago now. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Substack. You can find me on Instagram. And you can find my podcast anywhere that you listen to audio-only podcasts like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And I'm trying to release more chapters of a book on Substack called Sleepless. And have a couple articles coming out this week, as well as a podcast on Huey Long with John Slaughter, and part 4 of the Use Public Mural series with my new co-host, Rick Torres.
I'll definitely have links to all those at the bottom. If you're listening to this, I want to say thank you for making it all the way to the end. You know how to support Double Dealer. You can buy a magazine, you can subscribe, become a paid subscriber on our Substack, you can like, you can share, you can do all the internet things. I'm very bad at ending podcasts, so I will say insert ending here.